Today, Wally and I take a look at the ghost town of Coolidge, Montana. Coolidge, Montana went from a town of 350 people to zero in a short span of 40 years. We'll look at how much money was invested into this project and what was the ultimate demise of this town. We hope you enjoy the show.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another chapter of Did You Know Southwestern Montana. I'm Wally Felt. My partner in crime over there, Jeremy Crawford, producer, director, and sound technician. And today, Jeremy, this show's kind of your baby, and I'm going to lead into that in a minute because we're going to be talking about a lost town of Beaverhead County. Now, here's a Dillon Tribune article, February 22nd, 1929. They listed that there were 16 towns in Beaverhead County. Now, when I read that, I'm thinking, that's interesting. Of course, I wasn't around, despite what a lot of people say. I wasn't around in 1929. Well, we were going on, before we went on the air, we were talking about there was Dillon, there was Dell, there was Armstead, there was Farland, there was Glen, there was Reichley, there was Lima, there was Argenta, there was Bannock, there was Wise River, there was Polaris, there was Wisdom, there was Gibbons, there was Menida, and the town we are talking about, Coolidge. Coolidge, very, very interesting little mining community up in the Elkhorn area. Now, in that same article, it talked about the towns in Montana in Beaverhead County that did not have a duplicate name or did have a duplicate name. Well, in 1929, besides Coolidge, Montana, there was a Coolidge in Arizona, one in Georgia, one in Arkansas, and one in Texas. There was also a Coolidge, Wisconsin, that was started around the same time period and also now a ghost town, but it's not named for our Coolidge. It's named for just an entrepreneur from that part of the area. Now, as we look at Coolidge, we have to go all the way back to 1872. As I look at my notes, 1872 was the time that silver mining first came into prominence in Beaverhead County, southwestern Montana. Correct, Jeremy?
That's correct.
And in that time frame, there was, it's called the Elkhorn Mining District, and it said rich veins of silver were discovered high in the Pioneer Mountains, 1872, by a man named Preston Sheldon. The claim was called the Old Elkhorn. And here's something I learned in our research. I didn't realize that the reason Elkhorn came about was the guys that discovered it found a couple of elkhorns right there and said, now we know.
Yeah. That's kind of funny because I always wondered how that area got the name Elkhorn. And my thought was, I thought maybe they came upon a lot of sheds or something in a meadow and called it Elkhorn. And that's kind of what they did. Well,
that would be the historic puff version of it. It seems like most of them are like this.
Yeah.
It's just happened. Okay, there's two Elkhorn. Hey, let's call this place Elkhorn.
What should we call this place? You look around, the first thing you see
is Elkhorn. Now, the 2 years later, so that would make it 1874, there was a major silver vein found by Mike T. Still that was called the Storm Claim. No explanation on why they called it the Storm Claim, except I'm thinking there's probably a thunder boomer or something passing through that area, and that became the Storm Claim.
Definitely probably a thunderstorm overhead while you found it, and
which is
Storm Claim mine.
We know growing up in this area, that's kind of a fun June, July, and August event in Beaverhead County is the thunderstorms that come rolling in out of the Pioneers.
Yep.
So more and more prospectors began to flood the area. Dozens of claims and mines began operations, although the work was severely restricted due to the lack of, economical transportation. Now this is going to bring into play another little tad bit of history that we talked about when we were talking about the Metland. Remember Carine, Utah?
I do.
In fact, we discovered Carine, Utah was very prevalent in this era because it was kind of a hub that people go. Well, that was the place that people took their silver ore. Can you imagine the trip? No I-15, no nothing, just trails and one railroad. And I'm not even was the railroad even, it wasn't even in existence in 1874.
Don't think it was. I think is what they did is I think Corinne was the hub for the railroad. I'm almost wondering if that's where it might have stopped at the time.
Well, it says they hauled the ore from those claims in Elkhorn to Corinne, Utah, and from Corinne, Utah by railroad to San Francisco.
Yep. Yeah, so I'm thinking that was where the railroad basically was at the time. And if you wanted to get your merchandise or your ore, in this case, to a new place, you had to basically haul it by wagon to
Corinne. You know, I'm thinking we need to make a road trip this summer.
I know. And, you know, another little bit of trivia is a couple weeks ago during that snowstorm when I was bringing my kids back to Butte, there was a trailer in front of us being pulled, and it was from Corinne, Utah.
Like I said, that's three things in a row now. We first started talking about it with the Metland, your trip returning your kids to Butte, and now this figuring into the silver mining industry. I'm thinking it definitely deserves a road trip to Corinne. And now, despite all the transportation problems, and I'm saying there were probably a lot of those.
Oh, yeah.
The mines were profitable and became even more so following the completion of the Utah Northern Railroad to Silver Bowl, Montana in December of 1881. So I'm thinking that they just completely left out this little community, if it was a community then, or was it tents and whatnot yet?
At that time, it was still tents. You know, it really didn't become a community till about 20 years later, I think is what it was. And even then, spoiler alert, still wasn't much of a community.
No, well, and here you're right, because it said they had all kinds of mines in the area, and I love the names of these people.
Yeah.
9. There was the mine called the Critic, one called the Fraction, one called the Navajo, one called Good Enough, one called Park, one called Red Sky, one called Hamburg, one called Washington, one called Guy, one called Last Chance, which I wonder if that guy went to Helena.
I almost wonder if that guy was on his last chance. If I don't find something, then we're done.
Cleopatra, I like that one. Mascot and Cleveland. But as Jeremy said, it would be a couple of decades before Coolidge got its start.
Yeah, and you know, the interesting thing is a couple of these mines that, you know, were the mines that actually produced mineral. They were anywhere from 30 to 90 feet deep. So, I mean, these people back in, you know, 1880, 1887, they were not just scratching the surface of the earth. They were digging 90-foot deep shafts.
And with equipment from 1880s.
Yeah. And
shovels, picks, probably a stick of dynamite now and then.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure that there's quite a bit of dynamite used, but you got to realize, too, they are not in a town. They are in the mountains. I mean, if you ever go to Coolidge, you will realize it is out in the middle of nowhere up in the mountains.
And you were talking the other day, and you said that was the real thing that impressed you and surprised you at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid growing up, I always saw pictures of Coolidge. I always saw pictures of the mill. You know, it's this giant mill. I think somebody said in my research it was 2 acres.
That's pretty big.
And, you know, if you ever take a drive down the scenic byway, you know what type of mountains you're in. And you're in trees, and then a meadow will open up, and then you're in trees, and then a meadow opens up. Coolidge is about a 1-mile hike off the scenic byway, and you go up into the middle of those trees you're looking at. And it is literally a ghost town in the middle of a forest. And, you know, there's a little rickety road that takes you up to it. You know, a four-wheeler can get in there. You can hike in there. But that was the road that took you into there. So, I mean, you think about it, to get into that town, you know, 1,800 style, you had a horse and buggy. So, that was very slow. And the thing that kind of they needed to figure out is if they wanted to mine these mines, they had to figure out how they could make it more profitable and also make it faster. They needed to be able to get in and out with the ore. And that's kind of where our story is going to take kind of an interesting turn.
Okay, well, in 1893, silver prices had crashed. And, I was surprised. I guess I didn't do the research I needed to. I didn't know about the silver portion. I thought it was probably gold because that's what, Bannock was and stuff. But then as you dig deeper, pardon the pun, as you dig deeper, then you realize that we had a pretty good crop of silver up in the Elkhorn area.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. Like you look at Bannock. Bannock was really, well known for the gold. And then you go north a little bit more and you hit Coolidge, which is silver. Go north a little bit more and then you're in Silver Bow County, which even though it's called Silver Bow County, it was built on the copper. So it just kind of seems as you go north in Montana, you get into different mineral deposits, probably geological reason why. But it really shocked me because I had no idea what the mill was for in Coolidge. Honestly, I originally, I never did a lot of research growing up, but I just thought it was like a tree mill. Like I thought it was where they made lumber because that would make sense where it was at. So as I got more and more interested in it and I found out that, this mill was used to mine silver, that just blew my mind away. Now Elkhorn's known for its skiing, its outdoor recreations, but it's hard, in Crystal Park, but it's hard to believe that at one time, the amount of silver they were actually able to get out of there when they were able to mine. But again, like you said, in 1893, silver prices crashed and it almost put an end to the whole operation.
Well, and then a few years later, in fact, the year my grandmother was born, 1903, silver prices had recovered and started a little bit of resurgence in the Elkhorn mining operations. New finds stimulated, I like how they use that word, in reopening the Elkhorn mine. Now, here we enter into what faces a lot of businesses, whether they're mining or whatnot, financing. There was not adequate financing, so that Elkhorn mine just kind of sat there and collected dust and silver waiting to be discovered. 3 years later, a man named Frank Felt, no relation, he spells his name different, began to buy up a number of claims, and he, along with M.L. McDonald and Donald B. Gillies, started a tunnel. Now, do you know how to say this word, Idaho? Is that what you say, Idaho vein? Discovered the Idaho vein?
Yeah, I think that is. I was thinking either Idaho or Idahog.
And I'm trying to figure out there's no explanation. There's another thing we're going to have to dig out is how they come up with that.
I honestly think some of it might have been just lack of not knowing how to spell, and maybe they were trying to call it the Idaho vein or something.
Oh, you're probably right. Yeah, because you go back to those days, writing and reading and stuff, it was not something that everybody knew how to do. It was, not everybody had the opportunity to go to school. Some people, just work. So that's probably the explanation more than anything else. So anyway, that became the Elkhorn District, or the major producing mine in the Elkhorn District. Now we get closer to Coolidge's formation. A Montana politician, always hate to use that word, Montana politician William R. Allen, who was the Montana lieutenant governor. He formed a mining company called the Boston Montana Mining Company. And after investigating claims, they reopened the Elkhorn mine. And the following year, the town of Coolidge was born. So that would be 1914?
Yes.
1914. And it was named after his friend, Calvin Coolidge, who went on to become president of the United States. Now, you probably found this in your research. There's one instance where it says that the soon-to-be president invested monies into the mining, And there's other ones that they just say it was named after him because there was a friend. I'm thinking it goes back to the naming or the monies part.
Yeah, I am too. I'm thinking part of it was probably invested money into it, but just like politicians today, they invest money into something they don't want people knowing, because this could have turned into being something really big. And, as he became president, I needed to pass some laws and stuff or get stuff pushed through that would help him.
But 1914, Coolidge begins. And I'm going to kind of turn things over to you for a little bit now, because this is where you became, I know in our initial conversation when you said we need to do one of our stories on Coolidge, when you started talking about all the things that got Coolidge going,
yeah,
your eyes were about as big around as silver dollars. So let's learn about the building of Coolidge.
Okay, so Coolidge is, in my opinion, probably the most interesting place I've ever seen a town. I honestly didn't see it with my own eyes till about 3 years ago. And unfortunately, by that time, a lot of the stuff had already been taken down. The mill had been stripped of the wood. The town is falling in on itself. From what I understand, there's only one building that's still standing, and that was the postmaster's building. And that building was used up until 1932. And so that kind of gives you an idea how quick Coolidge jumped up and how quick Coolidge fell. And Coolidge, it had great potential, but Coolidge also had a lot of things working against it. The ore, like we talked about, that started the Elkhorn mines. So when they shipped a carload of ore, they would get 300 ounces of silver to the ton. So every ton of ore they would ship out of there, they'd get 300 ounces of silver, that's
a lot of silver.
That's a lot of silver. And the problem is, again, Coolidge was in the mountains, in the middle of nowhere. We talked about it. They had to load it up with wagons. So when our one friend, the lieutenant governor, and this kind of the other interesting thing about the lieutenant governor is he had a very promising political career. He actually stepped away from a flourishing political career because the mining bug bit him. And that was William R. Allen. So what he did is he got investors, and he formed his mining company, and they looked at Coolidge, and what he thought he needed to do was a few things. Number one, they needed a railroad in there. So that was his first major undertaking. The thing is a normal railroad is very wide, and they make a couple other different railroads that are skinnier. So that's what he needed to do. He made so the the wagon road had been built to the mines, and then he needed the rail line. So in 1914, heavy machines were then purchased to start clearing a way for the railroad. Again, Coolidge is the doomed town. What happened in 1914 shortly thereafter?
Little thing called World War I.
Yep. So all the machinery that was purchased in that just kind of never got delivered because they took the making of everything and started putting it into the war effort. And then also the other problem was he had some English backers, and that delayed the financing to purchase the machines. So, this guy sinks all his money into this town, and World War I hits, and it's kind of put on hold. So then the line for the Montana Southern Railroad, it was going to run up the Big Hole River from Divide and then up the Wise River to the mines. What could go wrong when you run a line across a river, right? That's not the only thing that the town needed. The mill also had, at this time, electrical equipment in it, so they needed electricity as well. So that was another thing that they decided to take on. After World War I, they decided that they were going to run electrical lines to the town, so they needed a giant line to carry electricity to this town. Again, remember, this mill is almost 2 acres. This mill sits on 2 acres. It had boilers, it had machinery, it had everything. A lot of money, too. Okay, so then the line for the Montana Southern Railroad was up the Big Hole River Divide and then over to Wise River Mines. In 1919, it was completed and was reported to have been the last narrow gauge railway built in the United States. Again, we talked about a normal railway, which was wider. The tracks were set apart. This one here was more narrow. Reason why they probably built that was because they were taking it through the trees alongside a river, probably a lot less work.
Well, and I found a little thing on narrow gauge. Narrow gauge, narrower than the standard rail is 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide. That's standard. Most narrow gauge railroads are between 600 millimeter. I'm not going to try and translate my into. It was between 1 foot and 11 inches, or 11 and 5/8 inches, to 3 feet 6 inches. So which one do you think it was? I'm thinking it was probably the 3 feet 6 inches one. They needed probably something a little sturdier to handle the ore and stuff.
Yeah, I'm thinking that too. I'm thinking they would have probably had to go with the widest they could go with the narrow gauge, just because not only are they hauling ore in and out, but they're also going to be hauling passengers, and then that's also how they're going to get the machinery into Coolidge.
And supplies.
Yeah, and supplies. So it was completed in December of 1919. The railroad was equipped with 3 Baldwin locomotives, 28 freight cars, 3 passenger cars, a machine shop, an engine house, and depots at a total cost of $1.5 million.
Wow.
And that was in 1919 cost. That was not today's cost. That was 1919 cost. But there is also, some people say he kind of fudged a little on his record keeping. And they want to say that they were putting the cost more at $2.1 million. So right there, to get his little mining operation going, that's $2.1 million that was put in just making a railroad that could bring the materials, the people, the supplies, everything you needed for this.
That's a lot of green.
That's a lot of green for today's standards. Again, we talked how Coolidge was named after Calvin Coolidge, and there's a little bit of a mix-up on that, or, 2 different reasons why. So the town had both telephone service and electricity that was provided by a power line. This power line would carry 65,000 volts down it. Wow. It would run from Divide over the hill into Coolidge. What do you think the cost of completion of that power line was?
$1.7 million.
It was $150,000.
Which is probably 1.7 million, or a little more.
It was a little cheaper than his thing. So in October of 1918, Coolidge hit a milestone. As families were starting to move in, it got its first school. So in 1918, Coolidge got their school. Now, this has been almost a 40-year span from the time that they found the gold to the time... silver, to the time that they found the silver to now the town has a school. The town is also starting to take shape, but one thing with Coolidge is because it was so remote, most people don't realize it. There were some houses and stuff. This is a map of the town of Coolidge, how it was laid out. You can see Elkhorn Creek running through it. You can see where the mill is. You can also see the train tracks that take you to and from the mill. And then also they had a train that took you to the mine. But if you notice, as you're looking at this map, you will not see a church, because there was never a church established in Coolidge. They did have a pool hall. They had a store. They had a Staples store. They had a sawmill.
And they had a Staples store?
Yep.
Like Staples?
Not that one.
Oh, okay.
So is what they did is, as you look, you'll see like the community hall, you'll see Ripley's home and all these other homes. And then you'll see these little markings on the map called B, or 13 is what it almost looks like. And is what those were is, for the people that were mining, they didn't have houses. They had bunk houses that would hold so many people, but those areas, they were actually a wooden decking put out that they could pitch a canvas tent on top of. So it got them up off the cold ground, but they were still out in tents if the bunkhouses were full. So Coolidge honestly didn't have a lot of houses in it. It did, though, actually have a post office. Again, that's kind of one of the things that sets Montana. We call it a town. It's usually because it has a post office. Doesn't matter how small it is.
Incorporated or unincorporated, yeah.
Yeah, and that was one thing that Coolidge had, is it had that post office. So then, again, they start getting their stuff together. The town starts going, and again, silver prices drop.
Well, one thing you noticed, or one thing I think you failed to mention in the kind of how the town was laid out, they were lacking a very important. I mean, they did have a pool hall.
Yeah,
they did have that, but there wasn't a club bar down the corner or something like that.
They did not have a saloon, although you could buy alcohol. So there was not an actual saloon, which, again, that's kind of strange for a Montana town. I mean, every small town has their saloons, but Coolidge did not have one. Again, that was sold out of the Staples stores.
Didn't you say that they also someone had a thriving business of homemade alcohol?
There were a few moonshiners. And that's kind of the comical thing is, again, this kind of shows you the remoteness of the town. There just wasn't stuff that people could grab. I mean, I'm sure the people, it sounded like to me the way it was set up is, it's one of those things where once you got there, you kind of the company kind of owned your soul, because everything was company owned. I'm pretty sure the stores, they didn't actually come out and say it, but I'm thinking the stores were ran by the company too. So, your boarding, anything you bought, they said the supplies for the miner were, through the store. All that was probably just charged to your paycheck. And that was
a very common way to do business in those times.
Yep. And another thing they said was there was very rudimentary plumbing in Coolidge. So there were a few houses that did have some sort of plumbing. Most people, if they wanted to take a shower, they went to the mill, because the mill actually had boilers there. So they could produce hot water at the mill. And I guess the mill was where people would go to shower. One of the most interesting things that I've ever found when you go to Coolidge, just kind of give you an idea of the houses. I'll just kind of show this picture here. These houses, this is kind of the picture, and this is kind of what you see when you go to Coolidge. And a lot of these houses have fallen in on themselves. This is kind of an older picture. But if you look at them, one of the things you'll see as you're looking at these houses is you will see garbage out the back door. Just piles of old cans and stuff. And is what those piles are is back then, they didn't have a town dump. So they would just literally open up a can of beans, cook it, and then throw it out the back door. Or there'd be bottles back there and stuff. That was kind of their sanitation back then. And then kind of to give you an idea also of the mill and the size of it. This is a before picture that shows the mill, where on your left you can see what it looked like. On the right is what you see today when you go to Coolidge, which is the concrete pylons, and then also in the second story. Because they built this mill, it would actually run up the hillside. I mean, it's pretty impressive when you start looking at it. It just blows my mind again that you think like you're out in the middle of nowhere, and 1800, late 1800s, early 1900s, we built this.
Without the machinery and technology that we have nowadays.
Yep. So again, silver takes a plunge. The mill was just getting to operate, and then silver dropped out. So the mill didn't operate to capacity. It had the ability to really operate, but it never hit capacity very often. 3 months in 1922 to 1923, it operated at capacity. And 4 months in 1925. Those were the only times it was ever recorded that this mill was able to operate to full capacity. They would have 3 shifts of men per day run the operation using only one section of the 2 identical parallel processes available. And these processes where they would use the oil flotation process, the mill saved from 90 to 93% of the metals out of that ore, which that's
good.
That is. I mean, again, we live next to a plant that processes talc, and they have some kind of similar floating processes and stuff. And I think even today, that's probably what they're probably pulling out. Don't quote me on that, but when I worked there, I think that's about what it was. When I was going to college, I'd work there during the summer, and I can remember, they'd brag and they'd say, well, with this new machine, we're able to get about 95% recovery. So, I mean, back then, 90% recovery on this was really well. They would do 8,900 tons of concentrates were produced from 40,000 tons of ore. Shipment was suspended again in 1927. What do you think happened in 1927?
The beginning of the Depression.
Yep. And also, the Wise River Dam broke.
Well, that would depress me.
And this again, Coolidge was kind of the town that should have never been there. And God, I think, was telling them on all corners that you guys do not belong here. It's out in the middle of nowhere. Every time they tried to build something, it seemed like a war would happen that'd shut them down, or there'd just be something that would shut them down. Then once they were finally up and running, the Wise River Dam broke.
Well, and prior to that, the whole mining operation was put in receivership.
Yeah. Yep.
So, yeah, he's getting all these little hints, but he doesn't listen to anybody.
And in a way, that kind of shows why he probably was such a good politician. He's getting lots of hints, but he just kept going on his merry way. Rooms on fire around him, and he's sitting there smiling. When the Wise River Dam broke, it destroyed a section of the railroad. And by the time the railroad was repaired in 1930, metal prices fell again. But this time they had declined to the point where it seemed inadvisable to operate. And again, this is millions and millions of dollars sitting on this mountainside, and literally they said, we're done. Everything's against us. We can't do this. We can't produce money off of this. So that was when stuff started to be shutting down. And I think it was 1934, the post office finally closed its doors. 32. So when they closed their doors in 1932, that was pretty much the final nail in the coffin for Coolidge. But again, here's some kind of interesting things about the money that was sitting up there. So the construction of the mill. Again, the mill is 2 acres. So if you think about it, that is a mill in itself that sits on, 2 acres of property. It's got the concrete, it's got the wood. It was built at a cost of about $900,000. So when I saw that, I was like, holy cow, that's a lot of money. So they figured that it was fully completed in 1922 along with the power line. The total cost of the mill in today's money would be $14,013,321.
Wow.
So the $150,000 that was spent on the power line, that was $2,335,557. When the mill was completed in 1922, it was the largest mill in Montana. It was equipped with steam heat, a sprinkler system, a 2,500 cubic foot air compressor. This is 1922.
Yeah.
2 crushers, 2 ball mills, 4 classifiers, 16 concentrating tables, 2 settling tanks, 2 thickener tanks, a large filter, and 52 electric motors to operate the mill's oil flotation system. The mill was designed by O.B. Hofstrand, and the system had the capacity to process, 750 tons of ore per day with a recovery rate of 90 to 93%.
Wow.
So
another wow.
And it's crazy because it's like this town, when you hike up to it, you're hiking and you're like, where am I going? When it opens up, it's kind of interesting too, because you see the mill up on the hillside, but the town is kind of laid out through the trees. And then it's also laid really close to the creek that runs through there. And actually, there's a couple houses that are now sitting in the creek. It's just the roof with the creek running through it. And, you just kind of look at it and you're like, what were they thinking? And
well, it seems like they didn't, all the monies they invested in construction of the railroad and all that other stuff, you'd think they would have put some of those dollars into clearing the land a little bit to have some space to build their town instead of building it around the trees.
And honestly, I think is what they did is I think they cut down the trees and built whatever they were building right in the middle of where they cut down the trees. So I think they'd go in and they'd clear out the space they needed to build something. They'd probably cut down those trees. They had a mill there, so they would probably mill that wood, turn it into boards, and then build right where they had just cut down these trees.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
It's, and again, this is kind of one of those things where Coolidge was a town with so much potential, but in the wrong spot.
Well, and I'm thinking, too, there was not much planning. If what you say is true, and it probably is, that's not a way to build a town.
Yeah.
Decide you're going to build something here, cut down, build.
Yeah.
And then leave all this tree right here instead of you look at you look at the early days of Dillon and all the people that laid it out. They laid Dillon out.
Yeah.
With streets and they had a plan. It sounds to me like this guy's only plan was to build the mill and take care of the mines and the railroad, and the rest would just happen.
Yeah, and the crazy part is I could see maybe building the mill up there, so that as they brought this ore out of the mountain, they could process it right there. But the part I don't understand is why didn't they build the town farther down? And then have the train going up to the mill.
More level ground.
Yeah. Kind of like how Barrett's is outside of town 20 miles and the town's here. Why didn't they build a lot of this stuff closer down below and then maybe just build a railroad that would have taken you up to the mine even put the mill down below?
And I think you're just nailing nailing it down is there was no planning. They just it was pure ad lib.
It was.
The whole time.
And this is kind of the thing is this is just the tragic of how much money was thrown at this place. And I think you're right, too, is, like how people say, well, how did you decide to sell there? I threw a dart at the map. This was kind of like, why did you decide to build this size of a mill up there? Because that's where the mine, the mine was. Well, why didn't you move it away? That's kind of probably maybe something they thought about after they had started to sink this money.
Well, they probably had the mining engineers who discovered, well, I doubt if they were engineers, but discovered the silver, knew how to mine it, but there was no planning of anything other than how to dig a hole in the ground and get the silver out, how to make the mill work to process your ore, instead of looking at the fact, well, we got to do this intelligently. We have to have a good place to lay out our town. And, it's the first time, you just brought it up. And I think you just summed up why Coolidge is no longer Coolidge. Why it's just a bunch of wood in the forest is because they were narrow-sighted on the mine part of it, but didn't do any planning or anything else for anything else.
Yeah, and so here to give you an idea is in 1922, they figured the total cost of everything that was done up there was $5 million. So in today's value, that would be $77,851,785.
Wow. I keep using that word, but that's about the only word I can use is wow.
It's crazy to think that there was that much money sunk into something, and we look at stuff today and we think, how can they put, $1 million into that building, or how can they do that? This was $5 million in 1922. The post office ran from 1922 to 1932. The people that ran it were Frank H. Turrell and Evan L. Woolman. They had a school district, like we talked about, that worked. It was organized in 1918, and the most kids they had in there were 20 at a time.
And it was an entire district.
And it was they made it an entire district. The biggest the town ever had for a population was 350 people. And again, most of the residents they talk about in here, they would come to the area. There were some that lived there, but lots of people that go there to work were from Butte or Dillon because they had the railway, so they could probably get on that short line track. And again, it had so many passenger cars, and that'd bring people to and from. And it's crazy to think, it was finally, the company was completely shut down by 1950, completely bankrupt the company. And let me see here. The name of the company, the Boston, Montana Development Company, it started in 1922, again, by our Lieutenant Governor.
William Allen.
Yep. And then in 1950, it finally went under. I would hate to see the amount of money the investors poured into this.
Well, and also it said too, that they hadn't completely given up.
Yeah.
They were still looking for investors. And so after it went down in 50, they still spent another couple of years scrambling for investors.
Yeah. I think it was finally, let's see here, at the peak mill, 250 men. So, okay, here's kind of gives you an idea. The mine mill employed 250 men. Yet a total of only 26,000 tons of ore was mined from 1921 through 1924, and then another 20,000 tons was produced in 1925. But from then on, only a few tons were mined sporadically during the years, so 1935 through 37, 39, 42, 48, and 1953. Total production from the Elkhorn mines was 52,385 tons of ore, and from that, 8,900 tons of concentrates were produced for shipment to smelters at Tooele, Utah, and East Helena, Montana. So, they would send some to Helena, some to Tooele. The concentrates yielded 851,725 pounds of lead. So, lead was still worth quite a bit back then. 4,100 pounds of zinc, 370,799 pounds of copper, 180,843 ounces of silver, and 1,013 ounces of gold. So they actually got a little bit of everything out of this. And then in 1949, the company reported the total production of the Elkhorn mines amounted to $375,000.
Wow. Wow, and the other way.
This figure, however, could not begin to match the estimated $5 million that was invested in the project. And then in 1981, the Elkhorn mines were bought by Timberland Minerals Incorporated, and they did some exploratory prospecting work on the site for the next 3 years. They reported that there was good potential for silver as well as tungsten and molybdenum.
Don't look at me. I was an English history major.
But no significant production was reported during these periods, probably because they looked at the streak of bad luck and thought, do we really want to bring people up here?
I think they probably looked at all the money that was spent first, and then they figured in everything else.
Yeah. And, here's kind of the interesting thing with a lot of the research I did. They even came to kind of the same conclusion, a lot of these people that did research and wrote the history of, Coolidge. Their ultimate goal was, they said, ultimately it was not bad luck that caused the failure of the Elkhorn enterprise, but bad planning. The remote and difficult location of the Elkhorn mines required large investments in the transportation power and processing facilities, but company leaders inexplicably did not adequately plan for the capital outlay for the development of the Elkhorn facilities. And that's just it. I mean, you look at $5 million put into this mine.
Well, I look at the fact that if somehow we could come up with a time machine and go back to 1870 something with a plan,
yeah,
you know,
Yep.
our relatives would be very happy that we went back there and came up with that plan. Because who knows if you imagine the right people with a plan would have been there. The plan to not only the mining plan to come up with an economical way to do all the things that they want to do, like the town 20 miles away from the mill and stuff like that, and the town laid out in a place where you can have streets, not walking around trees to get to different places and whatnot. Well, then you're giving the town a little bit of a chance to grow.
Yeah, and another thing they said right after they opened up the mill and they got it running, they realized they built the mill too big. The mill was overbuilt for what it could produce. You know, they said that this mill could, the amount of ore and stuff that they were pulling out of the mine was unable to meet the capacity of the processing facilities. The project was left with too top-heavy capital outlay in equipment and facilities it was unable to finance. Even though the veins of ore in the Elkhorn district were extensive and of high grade, the company's shaky position was then further aggravated by the depressed economic conditions at the time. So not only did you sink all this money into it, but then you realize you shot for the moon and hit Jupiter.
Yeah.
But then also, you know, it was such a bad timing because, you know,
bad everything.
World War I, the Depression, the mine, you know, the dam breaking, Mother Nature, you know, and Elkhorn, you know, anybody that knows Elkhorn knows that it can be very unforgiving. You know, that where this mine is located is where the snowmobilers head because there's so much deep powder. You know, and you just think about it, you just think, holy cow, they put that in that area. So you're not only thinking about the mine, but also what do you think a winter up there was like?
Yeah.
You know, just imagine that, because this is where people are snow machining right now and probably 4 or 5 feet of powder.
And it may be 40 degrees down here, but there's a good chance it's 20 degrees colder up there, if not more so. And I'm thinking nighttime is below zero temperatures in the heart. I mean, we're approaching springtime now, so the temperatures even up high are a wee bit warmer than they normally are. But can you imagine November, December, January, and February up there? And you don't have, they talk about this, the Coolidge had all these amenities. Well, not really.
No. You know, and I mean, and when you think about it too, like you think that they had a boarding house, there was probably a rough sawn 2x4, not a 2x6 like a house wall is now. And on one side, there was probably a 1x8 or a 1x10 that they cut that they used for the outside siding. And on the other side, if you were lucky, there might be a lat and plaster wall, or there was nothing.
And
there was no insulation, no nothing.
And the heat probably came out of one of those iron kettle,
potbelly iron stoves.
Yeah,
yeah,
that heated everything.
Yep. Yeah, you know, and the sad thing is today when you go up to that mine and you look at it, you can see the equipment that was left there. You know, you can see a big. It's probably like part of the flotation system and stuff. You know, as you go up there and you look at it, it's pretty amazing. You know, again, here's a picture of what the mill looked like. And, you know, people took the boarding out of this mill and they completely tore it down because of the cost of, you know, again, this would probably be equal to like what barnwood is, you know. And then if you look up there right now, Wally, you can kind of see the one house that's sitting in the creek where it's just the roof left of it. You know, and this kind of shows you like that house right now where it's sitting obviously was built a little too close to the water. And, you know, it's just crazy to think that they put all this money into this town, but, you know, eventually where it was located was its own demise and just this no planning. It kind of reminds me of, you know, we'd watch the old Westerns and the train would pull up and the people would have stakes in their hand and they'd say, stake out your claim. And they'd go running off the train. And once they get to their claim, they would stake it out. That was their property. Well, it's almost like that's how they built houses here.
Well, yeah. There was no plan. There was no plan. Yeah.
No. And, you know, it's kind of interesting doing this research because like I said, growing up, I always heard stories of the ghost town up at Elkhorn. Heard there was a mine up there. Never went to it till about 4 years ago. My wife and her family and my kids and I, we all hiked into it. And I just sat there and I stared at it. And I was like, what were these people thinking? And then as you do the research and you find out, one guy had a promising political career, completely dumped that because he got
greedy.
Yeah, greedy, and they call it buck fever when you go out hunting. I wonder if there's
silver. Well, they call it gold fever. Silver fever. Yeah.
Yeah. So this guy, did the exact same thing on silver and just completely, there were people that said he had such a promising career in politics, he probably would eventually become a presidential nominee, if not president.
Wow.
And instead he invested $5 million. Well, got people to invest $5 million in a dune mine from the start.
And it's kind of it's representative, not just the failure of it, but the structure of Beaverhead County.
Yeah.
In that time frame, from the time that Bannock, the goldfields at Bannock, up until present day. I mean, a lot of the towns, and we went through these again: Dillon, Dell, Armstead, Farland, Glen, Reichley, Lima, Argenta, Bannock, Wise River, Coolidge, Polaris, Wisdom, Gibbons, Monida, and Divide. There's still remnants in many of these towns. Yep. What's going on, but one thing I didn't write down, because we're going to save it for another story, is these are towns, some incorporated, some unincorporated, but the number of mining camps, and we covered those just a little bit, but there was more. I mean, this Beaverhead County.
Yeah.
Wow. I'll use that word again. Wow.
Yeah. And it's really, you start looking and like you list off that list of towns that were in Beaverhead County and, Farland. It's just a memory that you drive by when you go up to Birch Creek. The ones underneath Clark Canyon.
Armstead,
and it's just crazy because, some of them, like take Dell, for instance, Dell has a few remnants left of it and it's still holding on, but how much longer is it going to hold on?
Well, my favorite part of Dell is the old eating breakfast at the old schoolhouse.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's out again. At one time, I know the people that were running it, they sold it and then they reopened it and I heard it's closed again. But, it's crazy. I mean, you got Monida, you drive by Monida Pass and then you drive by Monida, and if you look up, you can still see the old buildings that kind of remind you of the old western towns. And it's Lima, great little town, but not much there. Argenta, few people still live in Argenta. Again, when you go through the town, there's the remnants of mines.
Yep, but the nice thing about Argenta is there's still a few people that say this is my home.
Yep.
They aren't going anywhere.
No, they aren't.
And you talk, and they don't mind the drive into Dillon, and they don't mind the harsh winters because Argenta was like Bannock. They talked about Bannock. It would be hotter than hell in the summertime and icy cold and snowy and unbearable in the wintertime. Argenta was pretty much the same type of weather.
No, and again, Argenta was a town that had its own school, and now it's gone. It's on the lawn at the depot.
Yeah.
The museum. These one-room schoolhouses, they dotted the landscape of Beaverhead County, and again, these towns would pop up. Some of them were in places you wondered why they popped up, but again, when they did pop up, they did not have a car they could hop in and go 80 miles an hour down the highway, so they had no choice but to put a town there.
Exactly. Well, and it's like that list. Most of those towns that we just talked about, they're still around. There's still one or two people living. Well, except for Armstead. The only way you can live in Armstead is if you go float fishing on Clark Canyon Dam, and Coolidge.
Yeah,
those two towns. I mean, Armstead was still going Not strong, but it was still going. There were still people living when they flooded it.
Yeah, there was ranches and stuff that they had to buy out to flood that. You know, Armstead was the town that was doomed because it was in a canyon that would make a great dam. Otherwise, I think Armstead might still even be a little bit of a town today.
Well, and you can what was it, 5 or 6 years ago when the
dam
drought
was really low.
You could drive out there and you could drive right up to the edge and where Armstead still was.
You could actually still see the foundation of the schoolhouse. So, you know, and there's actually, if anybody's interested, you know, one thing that you can do is get on YouTube and look up, there's a person, I wish I could remember who it was, but they actually uploaded an old family video. I think it's like a high 8 that they converted to digital of them driving through Armstead right before they flooded it.
Wow.
So yeah, it's pretty interesting because you do get a really good glimpse of what Armstead was.
Well, I remember as a kid going out there with my grandparents and my mom and watching it all happen. You know, all the ceremonies they had and everything else, and then boom.
Yeah, and one thing my mom mentioned when she was a kid and going out there, she said she remembered that there were a lot of, and you can still see some of them at the base of the dam, but there was a lot of natural springs. And she said that she remembers them like covering those up when they did the highway, like they were just going to demolish those natural springs.
Well, that's too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you go down below the dam, there's a little walk you can take, and it's got signs up for birds and stuff. But if you actually look down, you can see water bubbling up in the water where the springs are still, some of them.
Well, it's been really interesting, and just exploring one community, as you said, that had so much potential, but as the jury of Jeremy and Wally have come up with, it was basically, you know, the potential was there, but the planning wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it was one of those things where, you know, it would have been an amazing thing, but again, it was kind of like they shot for the moon and they hit Jupiter.
I'm thinking they missed Jupiter and it was farther out than that. They might have that thing that's not a planet anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. You know,
Pluto. They aim for the moon and hit Pluto because, you know, as you read down the things that happened, it was just like, why?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. You know, you read down it and you see this list, and it was just, again, it was something that was kind of doomed from the start, but then also you hear how they overshot this mill and produced too much. And
well, I think in our research in doing this, I think we've proven one thing: Beaverhead County remains an amazingly interesting place, and you and I need to do some more exploration of some of these other small towns that are still around in one way or another.
Yeah. Yep.
And kind of not only educate ourselves, but teach because I mean, we have a lot of new visitors in Beaverhead County, and it would be nice to help them understand what a glorious, I mean, you talk about history. They always say, my grandmother used to tell me that our corner of Montana is so full and rich in history. And Grandma was right, but this little corner, I mean, I think she was talking about all of southwestern Montana, but if you look at our little Beaverhead County, the largest county in Montana, it may be the largest county in Montana, but it also had the largest amount of history that maybe people don't really know about.
Yeah, I think a lot of Beaverhead County's history is overlooked because there were like Butte had the Copper Kings, and you know, Dillon's known for Bannock and partially the Vigilantes, but honestly, I think a lot of that also is kind of taken over by Virginia City in that area. You know, and I was talking to one of my friends, and again, Harry Andrus, who was the Andrus Hotel, he was telling me how much of an impact he made helping with rounding up the wild horses.
Harry Andrus?
Yeah. And he said that you can actually still drive to certain parts up by Clark Canyon Dam and see the old horse traps where they were a corral where the horses would come in and then they would shut it behind them.
See, there's another little tidbit of history in Beaverhead County, but we can't cover them all right now
Got to keep the show going.
Got to keep the show going. But I think we're pretty much wrapping up things. I think we've covered everything we wanted to cover. And I'm sure we could probably go on because I explored it, you explored it, and it's a fascinating amount of history. We urge people, you want to, when the weather gets a little nicer, you want to take a drive on the scenic byway. It's beautiful anyway.
It is. And
then find Coolidge. And let's see now. Coolidge is located south, they say south of Butte.
Yeah.
If you're in Dillon terms, you head south. You get off on the Jackson Highway 43, and you drive
30 miles to Polaris.
Then
you get on the scenic byway. You can't miss it. I mean, it's literally the main road that takes you to Polaris. And you'll follow the scenic byway, and you'll see turnoffs. You know, and the scenic byway, honestly, is a great day trip because you can go to Polaris. If you want to do it in reverse, you can do that too, but there's Elkhorn Hot Springs. There's Crystal Park. There's Coolidge. And there's about 500 pullouts. I did a little video on it one day that kind of showed all the cool little things. And, you know, Coolidge is one of those ones, if you are on the scenic byway, pull over, spend the 10, 15 minutes hiking into it. It's only a mile away. If my fat butt can hike into there, anybody can. Hike into it and just see it for yourself. You know, and the cool thing is the road you turn off on the scenic byway. Tried to find the picture, I couldn't find it. There is some beautiful scenery on your way up to the trailhead to Coolidge. It's well worth a drive.
Well, and I'll throw in some safety tips too. If you go in and have a picnic, whatever, pick up your garbage and take it out with you. Make the land. I mean, the land's already beautiful. We don't want to spoil it by.
We don't throw it out our back door like they did back then.
No. Good point. Enjoy it, and
bring the bug spray.
Oh yeah, I forgot it. But that place is Can you imagine in those days? No bug spray. Horseflies. Now we're bringing up a whole new animal. So we're going to leave it right there at the bite of a horsefly.
Sounds good.
And I'm going to say thanks for watching. Jeremy, thank you for a great job. You you were the ramrod this time around on a great piece of southwestern Montana history. So I'm Wally Felt. He's Jeremy Crawford. We'll see you next time on Did You Know Southwestern Montana.
We hope you enjoyed the show.